The winter of 1879 came too early and stayed too long, spreading through Rose Hollow like a sentence passed down by something older than law. Snow didn't fall so much as descend, in sheets, in silence, in judgment, blanketing the chapel roof and freezing the breath of every mother who stood trembling outside its doors. Inside Rose Chapel, the candles still flickered and the sermons continued as they always had. But something was wrong. Deeply wrong. The infants baptized that winter never saw another sunrise. One by one they were found in their cradles with skin blued and eyes open stiff as porcelain, as if they had died mid-thought. Not one cried. Not one stirred. Their deaths were not loud but quiet, terrifyingly quiet. The kind of silence that made the town doctor, Harold Matson, say to himself over and over again, "Their lungs never wanted to be here." He began to write those exact words in the corners of his medical ledgers. Silent lungs, a phrase that felt more like a curse than a diagnosis. At first they were buried like all babies were, small coffins, small prayers, smaller crowds. But by the third death, the ritual stopped. The priest, Reverend Whitlock, began refusing to preside over infant funerals. He claimed it was better not to invite too much attention to God's revisions. No one asked what he meant. No one wanted to. The bodies started going into the ground before daylight, sometimes wrapped in bed sheets or left in baskets, and always salted. Rock salt rubbed across their foreheads and their mouths stuffed with cloth. The salting was not discussed, but every mother found it there, already done, as if someone else had prepared the body during the night. The doctor tried to question Whitlock about it once, only to be told that God's fire needed the salt to know what not to burn. That same week, Dr. Madson's house caught fire. His ledgers burned. His dog disappeared. He said nothing after that. The first mother to speak out was Agnes Weller. Her child, Lydia, had been born full of warmth and hair and that newborn scream that tears into the lungs of the living. But days after her baptism, she stopped making sound. Agnes said the baby smiled, not happily, but as if something else had curled her lips for her. That night, Lydia was found cold and wet. Not from any fever, but wet with brine. Her entire body had been coated in salt water and her crib sheet was soaked through. Agnes screamed through town until her voice snapped into a whisper and no one stopped her. They just watched. And then 3 nights later, she walked into the woods barefoot and left no tracks in the snow. The pattern grew. Every infant brought to the font at Rose Chapel that winter died within 7 days. Every single one. The bodies showed no wounds, no infection, no bruising. But all of them had something strange behind the neck. A tiny welt like a crescent or branding, the kind you couldn't get from any normal hand. Some said it was a birthmark. Others said it was a warning. But it was always there, always fresh. Mothers started asking to delay baptism until spring. Whitlock refused. He insisted on winter baptism. He said that only the cold could hold the soul still enough for God to see it. He smiled while saying it. That calm, pastoral smile that never reached his eyes. He said it gently, and it broke something in the people who heard it. Because in Rose Hollow no one questioned God's house, not after the famine, not after the mines collapsed, and not after the fire that took the old church and half the town. Whitlock had rebuilt everything, and he had rebuilt it from stone that didn't melt in heat. The worst part wasn't just the deaths, It was the order of it. It was the way each child seemed chosen, methodically, as if someone were ticking names off a list that no one else could see. It was the way the families didn't even resist after a while. They handed over their babies like borrowed time. Some mothers began sleeping with knives beside the crib, but they never heard anything, never saw anything. Only the sound of the chapel bell ringing faintly after midnight, even though the rope had frozen weeks ago. Some swore they saw shadows outside the windows, not human-shaped, not animal either. Something stooped, something dragging behind it, something that hummed what sounded like lullabies through the snow. As January turned to February, the wind itself seemed to carry grief. People stopped speaking of the chapel, though it sat in the center of town like a wound that refused to clot. Dr. Madsen, now nearly bald from stress and sleeplessness, began carving symbols into his office floor. He said they were counter runes to keep the lungs open. His assistant found him 2 weeks later slumped against a cabinet, tongue bitten through, having suffocated himself with plaster. It was listed as an accident, but the assistant would later whisper that he had seen the same crescent-shaped welt at the back of the doctor's neck. By the end of that winter, 13 infants had died. All had been baptized, all had been buried without ceremony, and not a single voice in town could answer why. Rose Hollow no longer spoke of baptisms. They just waited for the thaw and hoped their turn didn't come next. Because by then every mother understood the truth, whether they admitted it or not. Whatever came through that water, whatever lived in the walls of Rose Chapel, it didn't want children to live. It wanted them hushed, before they could cry, before they could name the thing that touched them, and it wanted them salted so the soul wouldn't rise again. The silence wasn't an accident, it was the ritual, and the worst part of it all. No one had yet dared to break the pattern. Elias had always been small for his age, too thin for 13, with hands like curled twigs and a stare that made grown men uneasy without knowing why. No one remembered where he came from. Some said he was left at the chapel door during a thunderstorm years ago, bundled in linen soaked through with rain and something darker. Others swore he had always been there, just one of those children who clung to the edge of vision, never quite gone, never quite noticed. Reverend Whitlock claimed him as a gift, said Elias had the quiet soul needed to serve God's most delicate work. But there was nothing delicate about what followed. After the first 3 infants died, Elias began to change. Not loud, not sudden. It was gradual, like rot. He started waking up in places he hadn't gone to sleep, curled in the corner behind the altar, kneeling in the graveyard with dirt under his nails, standing beneath the bell rope with his hands twitching but the bell never moving. His face always calm, his mouth closed except for one sound, a low humming that matched the communion hymn sung only once a year. The hymn reserved for funerals of infants. He hummed it with a softness that felt colder than silence. He was found once at midnight, his bare feet coated in ash, kneeling beside the baptismal font. On the stone floor beneath him, he had scratched a circle over and over, so deep his fingernails cracked and left trails of blood across the chapel tiles. In the center of the circle was the same crescent-shaped mark found behind the necks of the dead infants. Reverend Whitlock ordered the tiles scrubbed and replaced before morning. When questioned, Elias said nothing. He simply stared, Not afraid, not blank, but calm, as though he understood something no one else could. The Reverend called it divine obedience. The doctor called it catatonia. The mothers called it evil. And yet no one removed him. He continued to serve at every baptism, hands steady, gaze fixed, always the first to touch the baby's forehead with water drawn from the old stone well behind the chapel. Water that hadn't thawed properly in months, water that smelled faintly of rust and rosemary. One night, the gravedigger Thomas Grinley followed Elias after chapel. Said he saw him crawl into the crawl space beneath the altar. Said the boy had something tied around his waist, a string of teeth. Not baby teeth, but molars and bicuspids filed down smooth, strung with old rosary wire. Thomas told his wife the next morning, and by sundown he was found dead in the church garden. His arms had been broken backwards and arranged like wings. His mouth was missing, lips stitched closed with fishing twine, the skin peeled clean to the jaw as if someone had tried to erase the last words he ever spoke. Whitlock preached at the funeral, said the Lord's work always met resistance. Elias hummed during the sermon. By February, the chapel floor was covered in symbols. They appeared overnight, etched into the wood with nails and splinters, some carved so deep the boards bent and wept moisture. No one saw Elias do it. No one caught him with a tool. But he had blood beneath his fingernails every morning, and the tips of his fingers had grown calloused and thick. Some believed he was writing warnings. Others believed he was following instructions. One mother, unable to cope after her baby's sudden death, stayed late one night and tried to confront him. She was found by the vestry door the next morning, eyes wide open, her own child's baptism blanket shoved so far down her throat it had burst the lining of her stomach. The coroner called it self-inflicted. Whitlock called it sorrow. Elias stood at the back of the chapel and stared at the floor. There was a hollow calmness to him, not vacant but practiced, as though he had been taught to feel nothing. The way he moved was precise, his footsteps aligned with the chapel beams, his movements almost mathematical. The town's physician, in a private letter later confiscated by state authorities, wrote that Elias exhibited signs of advanced hypnotic conditioning, possible ritual trauma response, and speculated that the child had been trained methodically to enter a dissociative state whenever near the baptismal font. But the most disturbing line in the physician's notes was this: "The boy does not blink. He breathes, but not as we do. It is shallow, patterned, as if synchronized to something unseen." Children in town began to avoid the chapel. Some refused to walk past it. They said they saw Elias watching them through the stained glass, even at night. One claimed he saw the boy cutting something into his own chest during Mass, and that the Reverend did nothing to stop him. One child, a 6-year-old girl named Nora, said Elias came to her in a dream, covered in salt, whispering about how to hold your breath long enough for the angels to notice. Nora was found in the river 4 days later, hands bound in prayer. By the end of the winter, the town no longer saw Elias as a boy. He had become something else, a fixture, a haunting. No longer questioned, no longer touched. He lived within the chapel's cold routine, a silent tool of Whitlock's doctrine. And yet beneath that ritual, something darker moved. A purpose not yet spoken, a system of suffering so methodical, so intricate that no one dared interfere, because deep down everyone feared what Elias might become if they stopped him mid-ritual. or worse, what he already was. Constance Holloway had delivered more children in Rose Hollow than any woman alive, her hands having coaxed hundreds of infants from their mothers' bodies and into a world too cold, too cruel, too tightly bound by rituals dressed up as grace. She carried herself like a caretaker, a quiet guardian of pain, never raising her voice, never asking questions. But by the time the infant deaths began, her calm had frayed at the edges. Her eyes stayed swollen, and her fingertips bore tiny pinpricks that no one could explain. The townspeople assumed exhaustion. What they didn't see was the locked drawer in her writing desk, hidden beneath layers of laudanum receipts and herbal salve orders. What they didn't find until much later was the ledger. A heavy-bound book wrapped in faded muslin and stained with a thin halo of old blood, where Constance had marked every birth she attended not by name, but by moon phase and temperature. The writing grew smaller over the years, more cramped, more afraid. And at the edge of each record for that terrible winter there was a single red crescent drawn in the margins, always in the same place, always the same size, identical to the scar found behind every dead infant's neck. When the doctor's apprentice finally opened it, his hands trembled before the first page turned. The earliest marks were almost mathematical. Observations, pulses, notes on breath and chord placement. But by the time the deaths began, the language had changed. The numbers vanished, replaced with phrases that chilled the skin. Hollow throat, blood retracts, mark appears before breath. Then, God requires the turn of the tide. They are shaped in pain. In the back of the book, wedged between two yellowed pages, was a single dried leaf soaked in what looked like clotted milk and copper. Someone had stitched a thread through the stem and anchored it into the spine of the ledger like a bookmark. Below it, scrawled in broken ink, were words that read, "There are patterns we are not meant to survive. The moon chooses its wombs. The child is only the gate." She never shared the ledger. It was found only after her death, when her small cottage was unlocked by the sheriff 3 days after her disappearance. They found her on her knees in the upstairs washroom, the birthing thread she always kept in her apron now threaded through her own lips, looped over and over again until her mouth was sealed shut. Her hands were folded in her lap, red and still. Her eyes were open, glassy but dry, locked in a final stare toward the window. The coroner said it was self-inflicted, though none could explain how she managed it so cleanly, or how she died without bleeding out. But the body didn't rot. Not for days. Even after being removed, the blood stayed dark, the flesh hard, as if her body had been preserved in something more than cold. The mortician quit that week, and his replacement insisted she be buried without ceremony. The Reverend complied. The grave was shallow. In the days after, stories began to slip from lips too afraid to hold them back. Mothers who had given birth under Constance's care recalled strange murmurs spoken just before the crowning. Foreign words, syllables that stung the tongue when repeated. Some remembered the midwife placing her hand at the back of the newborn's neck and pressing, not hard but precise, like checking for a switch that might flick something inside the child. Others recalled her singing, a song no one could hum, only describe as circular, a tune that never ended, only folded into itself again and again until it stopped. Some said she had become colder over the years, Others said she had grown desperate, as if trying to fix something invisible that only she could see. Her closest friend, a widow named Ellen Bray, came forward with a memory from months before the first death. Constance had spoken of numbers, not dates, but lunar alignments, cycles of the womb, the pressure of water against flesh. She said there were nights when God's eye turned sideways, and those were the only nights children could be cleansed. She said baptism was too late, that the soul could be shaped in the dark before the breath, before the scream. What terrified Ellen most was the way Constance said it, not with conviction but with terror, as if she wasn't choosing these things but repeating instructions, as if she were part of something she could no longer refuse. What the ledger revealed was even worse. Of the 15 children baptized that winter and later found dead, every one of them had been born on one of 3 specific nights: the waning gibbous, the first crescent, and the blood moon. No 2 were born in the same household. No 2 had the same surname, but each bore the crescent scar. Each received a whispered chant during labor, and each was registered by Constance alone. Her suicide became the town's last attempt at explanation. They clung to it. They said she had broken from grief, from guilt, from the weight of so many losses. But no one could explain the ledger. No one could explain the salted tongue found in a jar beside her bed labeled December's Cry. No one could explain the map carved into the underside of her table showing the chapel, the well, and something marked only as the lower gate. The deaths had not stopped. But now the town had something to fear other than silence. They feared the patterns. The idea that someone had tracked these children not for healing but for harvest. That behind the warmth of the midwife's touch, something else had been working all along. Something cold, intelligent, and ritual-bound. They feared that Constance was not the cause but the conduit, and if she was gone now, they wondered who or what had inherited her place at the gate. The thaw came late that year, the kind that turns soil to a thick, reluctant mire. And it was in that softened ground that the first shovel struck cloth instead of root. The gravedigger, searching for a place to set a new boundary post, pulled back a thin layer of earth and found a strip of linen, stiff, yellowed, and stained with a pale crust. He thought it was a remnant of an old burial, but the size was wrong, too small, too deliberate. When they cleared the rest of the plot behind Rose Chapel, the truth rose like a sickness through the air. 17 graves, each barely 2 feet long, each containing the swaddled remains of an infant. The linens were soaked through with brine, the threads rough and unwashed. Their tiny bodies had been laid in neat rows between rosemary bushes. The roots twisted around their forms as if the plants themselves had been guided to cradle them. Someone had tended this place. Someone had kept the herbs trimmed. Someone had poured salt until the soil itself was white and bitter. The townspeople gathered, silent but restless, as the bodies were uncovered. Their faces were pale from more than the cold. They had all buried children in recent months, and the thought that their own might be here, reduced to some nameless preserved relic, pressed on their throats until breathing felt wrong. Reverend Whitlock was summoned, and when he arrived, he stood over the graves with no visible shock, only a measured nod. He said they had been given a better resting place than most, that the salt would keep them pure, that rosemary would mask the scent so that God's messengers would not mistake them for the living. He spoke as though these burials were not a crime but a sacrament. He called them offerings to the angel of temperance, a name no one had heard him use before. His voice carried through the crowd, steady but edged with something raw, something that cracked at the corners like old wood. In the days after Whitlock's sermon shifted, they no longer spoke of comfort for the grieving or forgiveness for the flawed. Instead, he spoke of cleansing, of repairing what God had left imperfect. He said the Lord's work was like pruning a garden, removing what would grow crooked before it reached the sun. Each Sunday his gaze would drift to the mothers at the back of the chapel, lingering on the ones holding newborns, and his words would twist into warnings. He said some children were born with their souls already marked for ruin, that they were blueprints God had drawn in haste, and it was the church's duty to return them before they could corrupt the rest of his creation. The way he said it was not loud, not fevered, but certain. That certainty spread like a shadow across the pews, filling the air with a cold obedience that was harder to name than fear. There were whispers about the basement then, the locked cellar beneath the chapel that no one had entered but Whitlock and, on occasion, Elias. Some said it was where he stored church records and winter provisions. Others said they'd seen him carry buckets of meat down there, though no butcher had sold to him in months. A widow named Mara Vance claimed she heard sounds from below during evening prayers, a slow, rhythmic scraping, as if something heavy was being dragged across the stone. Once she swore she heard breathing, not labored but deep and steady like something sleeping. After that, she stopped attending services altogether until she was found at the edge of the river with her dress torn to ribbons, her eyes swollen shut. She was buried without an autopsy. Whitlock did not speak her name from the pulpit. The salted graves were left undisturbed after the initial discovery. He ordered them sealed again, claiming it was disrespectful to leave them open. He performed the reburial himself at dusk, dismissing the gravedigger and working alone until the ground was smooth and the rosemary reset. A boy who had lingered nearby swore he saw Whitlock kneel and press his lips to the soil after the last grave was covered. That same night, the boy's dog was found hanging from the chapel bell rope, its paws bound together with rosary beads. No one mentioned it aloud, but the boy's family stopped letting him out after dark. The method behind it all was becoming harder to deny. The salt was deliberate. It preserved the flesh, kept it from returning to the earth. The rosemary masked the odor and in older traditions warded off spirits. It was a burial meant not for peace but for keeping. Whoever had placed those children there had done so with purpose, not grief. Whitlock spoke of the angel of temperance as though it were a living thing, something that could be fed and in turn protect the town from a greater ruin. But protection came at a price, and in Rose Hollow the price was always paid in the smallest, weakest bodies hidden in a garden behind the chapel where the snow melted slowest and the air always smelled faintly of brine. By spring, the townspeople had stopped questioning the graves. The fear was too precise now, too sharp-edged to be fought in daylight. Mothers kept their infants inside. though some could not stop the summons to the font when Whitlock called. It was said that to refuse him was to draw the angel's gaze directly to your home, and no one wanted to know what it would take if it had to come looking. Those who had lost children began to change, their grief dulled, replaced by something stranger. An almost quiet pride that their child had been chosen, as if to resist would dishonor the sacrifice. It was the first sign that Whitlock's work was no longer just killing the young. It was reshaping the living, one sermon at a time. It was the organ tuner who found it, reaching into the baptismal font to draw out the mildew-soaked cloths that had settled in the water. His fingers brushed metal, not the smooth lip of the font's rim, but something colder, heavier, shaped by intention. When it emerged from the water, the chapel air seemed to tighten. It was a rod, brass gone green at the edges, forked at one end into two sharp prongs no longer than a thumb's joint. Along the shaft, faint lines had been carved with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Each etched mark numbered in tiny increments, each one darkened with something that could have been ink but smelled faintly of iron. There were runes as well, curling in thin obsessive strokes, each one the same repeated pattern. A crescent broken by a vertical cut as though the moon had been split. The prongs curved inward slightly, not wide enough to pierce a throat, but just right to fit into the soft roof of a newborn's mouth. When the tool was handed to Reverend Whitlock, he cradled it as though it were a relic, wiping it clean with a strip of white cloth and setting it gently upon the altar. He told those gathered that it was not an instrument of harm, but of salvation. That centuries ago in the mountain churches of Bavaria there had been clergy who understood the body as a flawed map, one that could be redrawn with the right tools. Sin, he said, was not only spiritual but physical, embedded in the nervous system before a child ever cried. These priests believed that by severing the hidden thread in the mouth, the connection between flesh and the soul's first breath, one could reconfigure the child, cut away what was unworthy before it took root. Whitlock claimed he had restored that holy practice, that God had given him the calling to finish what those men had begun. The explanation did not quiet the fear. The fork fit too perfectly with the deaths. The doctor's whispered notes about silent lungs seemed to echo in the minds of those who had buried children. The trauma it would cause was unthinkable, a blow of pain before a child could understand pain, a wound that turned the act of baptism into an execution cloaked in liturgy. But Whitlock described it as mercy. He said the brain was a field, and weeds must be plucked before the roots wrapped too deep. The fork, he claimed, did not kill. It refined. If the body could not survive the refinement, then it had never been meant to live. No one saw him use it in daylight, but there were signs. Mothers recalled the way he cupped their infants' heads during baptism, how he always lowered the child's mouth toward the water, how the baby's first cry after the font was not a wail, but a choking gasp that quieted too soon. A few who dared look closer swore they saw a thin line of blood at the edge of the lips, quickly wiped away with the priest's sleeve. And then, within days, the child would be gone, pale still, mouth slightly open as if trying to remember a sound it could no longer make. The instrument itself bore scars of its use. The brass was worn smoother along one prong, as though pressed again and again into yielding flesh. The calibration lines were not decoration but measurement, each mark corresponding to a depth. It was a device of exact harm, methodical enough to erase chance from the act. Those who tried to confront Whitlock found themselves disarmed not by his temper but by his calm. He would speak of precision, of the surgeon's steadiness, of the gardener's discipline. He would tell them that pain was not cruelty when its aim was perfection, that all creatures were pruned to fit the will of their maker. And the way he said it, steady and low, left even the most outraged feeling as though they had been made small enough to fit between those brass prongs themselves. Rumors grew of what lay beneath the chapel, that the basement held not stores of wine or scripture, but the broken remains of earlier forks, each one a failed experiment in the pursuit of cleaner, faster work. The choir boy Elias was seen carrying small bundles down there at night, his face blank as he descended into the dark. Once a fisherman claimed he saw Whitlock at the riverbank, dipping the fork into the current, letting the moonlight catch its edges before drying it with a square of rosemary-stained linen. Within a week, that fisherman's youngest daughter was dead, her baptism still fresh in memory, her small coffin heavy with the smell of brine. The town began to understand the pattern. The fork was not simply a tool, but a ritual in metal, part of a process older than their fear, something that worked only when combined with salt, rosemary, and silence. The deaths were not accidents, they were selections. Each one was methodical, devastating, and part of a design that reached far beyond the walls of the chapel. And yet no one removed the fork from the altar. Whitlock kept it in plain sight, as if daring them to touch it, as if knowing the weight of it in their hands would make them complicit. Because once you held it, you could never again pretend you did not understand exactly how it fit into a child's mouth. The bell tower of Rose Chapel had always been a place the townspeople avoided after dark, its narrow spiral staircase twisting into a blackness that smelled of dust and something faintly metallic. It was Elias who first carried the lantern up there one winter evening, his pale face flickering between the steps, but what he lit at the top was not the view of the valley or the cracked brass of the old bell. It was the wall. The walls of the tower were lined in perfect rows, each holding a mask no larger than a man's palm. At first glance, they looked like the work of a careful craftsman. Delicate faces cast in pale plaster, their mouths slightly open, their eyes unblinking. But the longer one looked, the more wrong they seemed. The teeth embedded in the plaster were real, small, crooked in places, some with roots still clinging to them. Infant teeth, dozens of them arranged with such precision that each mask's mouth seemed to grin in silent panic. The plaster itself bore faint indentations as if pressed against something soft and living before it hardened. Whitlock told anyone who asked that they were memorials, representations of purity, each one made from the first teeth of the town's children. But there were too many, and the teeth too uneven, too irregular in age. Mothers who had lost infants recognized shapes they could not bear to name. The slope of a cheek, the faint curl of an ear. Beneath each mask was a single nail driven into the wood, and hanging from it a ribbon of cloth, each one stained differently. Some yellow with old spit, others gray with mildew, and a few stiff with a crust that smelled faintly of salt. The organ, too, had changed. Once it had been the heart of the chapel's music, the slow swell of its chords filling the rafters during baptisms and funerals. Now its sound carried something warped. The notes felt reversed, dragging inward instead of lifting. Whitlock had replaced the hymnals with wax cylinders, each holding recordings he claimed were archival blessings. But when one cracked, spilling its reel into the light, the truth seeped out. The sound was unmistakable, infants wailing, their cries played backward until they became something inhuman. A series of sucking gasps that made the air feel too thin to breathe. These recordings were fed into the organ's pipes, amplified so that the chapel's walls seemed to breathe with them. Whitlock called it the Breathless Angels program, and he claimed it brought the congregation closer to God by surrounding them with the sound of souls already refined. It was an old choir member, Mrs. Harker, who finally spoke of what the program truly was. She had joined decades earlier, long before the deaths began, when the choir was made up of children from the town. She remembered the rehearsals in the undercroft, the locked door, the thick curtains that kept out the light. Whitlock insisted the children sing with small cloths tied between their teeth and tongues, a gag that kept the sound shallow and tight. He said it purified the tone, forcing the voice to bypass the corruption of the breath. The children would choke and sob through the hymns, their eyes watering, their legs trembling. But he would not allow them to stop until the pitch was perfect. The gag was always soaked in salt water before it was placed in their mouths, so that the brine burned into their gums and made them drool until they could no longer swallow without pain. When they passed out, as they often did, their limp bodies were laid against the bell tower wall, where plaster was pressed to their faces to capture the moment of release. Most awoke eventually, some did not. The ones who survived rarely sang again. Their voices came back thin and strained, their lungs weaker than before. Parents were told it was the cost of discipline, that angels did not learn their hymns in comfort. And the parents believed because to disbelieve meant acknowledging what was being taken from their children in the name of salvation. Whitlock kept every mask, every tooth, every ribbon. He displayed them in the tower where only the brave or the desperate would see them, and he called it a gallery of perfected souls. The connection to the infant deaths was not lost on those who had seen the tower. The salt, the brine, the backwards cries. It was all part of the same ritual, a way to bind sound and silence together until neither could escape. In Whitlock's mind, each mask was a seal, each recording a tether. The children were not only dying, they were being turned into instruments, their pain preserved, their final moments replayed endlessly until the air itself carried their torment. The method was too precise to be madness. It was discipline. It was craft. And yet the most terrifying part was not what had been done, but how easily it had been hidden. The congregation still sang each Sunday, their voices drifting through notes bent by the organ's strange pitch, never knowing that the air carrying their hymns was thick with the breath of the dead. Those who had seen the masks kept silent because the thought of speaking it aloud felt like inviting something down from the bell tower, something that would fit a cloth between their teeth and teach them how to sing the way angels scream. Beneath Rose Chapel, past the stone steps slick with moss and the smell of standing water, there was a hatch few had ever seen, It sat flush against the floor of the vestry cellar, hidden beneath a warped carpet of woven reed. When pried open, the darkness below gave no sound back, only a breathless cold that seemed to rise from somewhere far deeper than a simple storage pit. It was Elias who first led the grave-digger's apprentice there, his small hand gripping the edge of the hatch as if pulling on a memory. The ladder creaked under their weight, each rung damp and swollen until the faint trickle of water met their ears. The air thickened with the stench of rust and something far older, the scent of decay that has learned to keep quiet. At the bottom stood a stone well, its mouth ringed with wax drippings and blackened incense cones, and there, half submerged in the water, was what remained of a saint. The statue had once been Saint Dymphna, carved in fine marble, holding a book in one hand and a cross in the other, her face serene. But she had been broken into pieces, each limb placed deliberately at the compass points around the well. Her head was missing entirely, replaced by a lump of calcified mineral encrusted with melted candles. The marble surface bore scratches as though someone had taken a blade to her eyes before breaking her apart. Rosemary stems floated in the water, tangled around the jagged edges of her torso. At her base lay a bundle of oilskin pages bound in twine and damp at the corners. The writing inside was Whitlock's. His journal entries spoke in the same calm tone as his sermons, each line clean and deliberate, describing what he called infant inversion. He wrote that some children were born not as vessels for grace but as conduits for rot, carrying sins older than their bloodlines, sins inherited from ancestors who had defied divine order. These infants, he claimed, could not be cleansed by ordinary baptism. They needed to be turned inside out spiritually, their inherited filth drawn up from the depths and replaced with purity. The method was not metaphor. He described the process as a physical inversion of the soul's breath, achieved only through the agony of drowning without death. His words were precise, almost surgical. The child must be submerged in water so still that the reflection in it held unbroken for the duration of the suffering. 7 days, if possible. The cries, he claimed, would carry upwards like smoke to the ears of the angel of temperance. He described those cries as heavenly, the closest sound to proof that the inversion had succeeded. One entry was marked differently, the ink darker, the handwriting tighter. It told of a test subject. No name given, kept in the well itself. The child was tied beneath the surface on a platform of cedar slats, just high enough that their mouth and nose could be drawn above water once a day for feeding. The water was salted, the temperature kept just above freezing. Whitlock wrote of the changes, how the skin took on a pallor like fine marble, how the breathing slowed into patterns he could predict, how the eyes, once frantic, grew dull and wide. He recorded the cries, timing them by the second, and wrote that on the 5th night the sound changed. No longer panic, but a drawn-out keening that made the flame of his candle tremble. He believed this was the moment the sin detached. On the 7th day, he said, there was no crying at all, only silence. The entry ended with a single sentence: "Return to the angel with no voice left to betray her." The horror was not just in the act, but in how the place had been arranged. The shrine was built for repetition, its tools ready for use. Hooks lined the stone walls, holding lengths of cloth and rusted wire. Small jars sat neatly in a row, each filled with water that had dark sediment settled at the bottom. The jars were labeled with dates, some from winters long past. The floor bore chalk marks that matched the compass arrangement of the saint's limbs, as though each drowning was carried out within the blessing of her desecrated presence. This was not a hidden crime born of frenzy. No, it was a system refined and kept alive in the dark. Those who came upon it that day could not bear to stay long. The apprentice swore he felt movement in the water, a slow turning beneath the surface as if something was coiling there. When he tried to speak of what they'd found, Whitlock stood in the chapel doorway framed by the afternoon light, his expression neither angry nor afraid. He simply asked if the water was still clear. The question lodged in the boy's mind like a splinter, festering each time he heard the organ's backwards wail or saw the rosemary sprigs hanging to dry in the rafters. The well became a silence in the town, a place unspoken but felt. And when another infant vanished from her crib that spring, the mothers knew without being told where she would be. They knew that the cries beneath Rose Chapel would not stop until they became the kind Whitlock called pure, the kind that rose in the dark, were caught by the water, and sank again into the cold. Dr. Thaddeus Wren arrived in Rose Hollow without ceremony, stepping off the supply cart with a leather case and eyes that seemed to have forgotten how to blink. He said little, smiled even less, and wore gloves even when it was warm. The town had no physician of its own since Madson's death, and the people were told Wren had been sent by the diocese to help relieve the burden of mounting infant illness. He took up residence in a cottage near the chapel and converted the back half into a makeshift surgery. But no one saw him treat the sick. No one watched him deliver a baby or stitch a wound. Instead, what filtered out in whispers and dread was something else entirely. That he worked only at night, that he asked for no payment, and that he collected the baptism linens that had touched the lips of the dead. Wren's obsession was not healing. It was silence. He spoke often in his journals of the anatomical seat of the scream, and believed that if the mouth was the gate to corruption, then there must be a way to close it. His notebooks, later found hidden in the rafters of his study, detailed his inspiration. Reports from the slave colonies in West Africa where, under the guise of control, overseers would sever tongues to enforce obedience, and later claimed the silence itself became a transferable energy. He believed that silence could be preserved like a mineral, drawn from the flesh of the young, and that the first few days of life held the greatest potency. His entries were technical, written like recipes. The newborn cry must be recorded first for contrast. Tongue must be removed whole, including frenulum. Soft palate tissue optional, though recommended for purity. Operation no later than day 3 post-baptism. The townspeople might never have known what he was doing if not for the night he was caught. A mother named June Talmore, whose baby had died 3 days after baptism, returned to the chapel after midnight, frantic and stumbling. She had heard a sound behind the chapel wall, a wet, gurgled cough that didn't match the voice of her own grief. When the sheriff forced open the cottage the next morning, he found Wren in his surgery, sleeves rolled and calm as ever, standing over a stone basin filled with cloudy liquid. In the basin floated a tiny tongue, pale and shriveled, anchored by a single thread of sinew. Around the room, pinned to the mirrored walls, were dozens more, each labeled in delicate handwriting with names and dates. The mirrors were not decorative. They were part of what Wren called his silencing chamber. The walls were designed to reflect every movement, every twitch, every facial reaction of the child undergoing extraction. He believed the mirrors trained the child to see itself suffering, and in doing so revealed the shape of sin trying to flee the body. The room was lined with damp cloth, the floor padded in old church robes soaked in salt water. There were no lights, only candle stubs in glass jars that burned just enough to show the child its reflection. The table was stone, the straps were leather. No child survived more than a day. He admitted none of it with guilt. His notes claimed success, that the removal of the tongue rendered the infant not just mute but spiritually inert, halting the spread of inherited madness. He claimed to have sold jars of these harvested silences to wealthy families in Boston, who believed they could cure their deranged children by holding the silence of a purer soul near the mouth while sleeping. One letter in his belongings thanked him for a noticeable stillness in a child who had once bitten at mirrors and screamed at invisible corners. The letter was signed only with an initial. Wren's body was never buried. After his capture, the townspeople dragged him through the streets, too shaken for prayer, too afraid to make sound. They left him at the chapel's door, hands broken, tongue cut out with his own scalpel. When they returned the next day, his body was gone. Whitlock claimed it was the will of the angel of temperance, that the man had been called back into the silence he served. But others saw something in the church's back stairwell that morning, a trail of blood leading down to the chamber below. A door left open and the soft echo of a scream trying to remember itself. Those who had seen Wren's instruments never forgot their shape. Small brass tongs curved like infant fingers, hooks no bigger than pins, a basin etched with verses not from scripture but from anatomy textbooks written in Latin. There was no question of madness. Wren was methodical, exacting, patient. He did not kill to quiet the town. He killed to measure the silence that came after. And in doing so, he gave Reverend Whitlock the perfect language to fold into his sermons, that purity could be taken, not given, that it had to be carved out of the body before the soul knew how to scream, and that even in death, a child could serve the choir if only its voice was caught at the right moment. No one remembered who first lit the candle, only that it had never gone out. It stood at the edge of the nave beneath the pulpit, protected by a rusted iron holder too tall for any child to reach and too heavy for wind to trouble. Its flame was strange, not bright but low and thick, as though the wax burned slower than time itself. The townspeople had grown used to its presence the way people grow used to a locked door, aware of it, respectful of it, but never asking what lay behind. It was said that the candle had been lit the morning after the first infant was buried without prayer, and that Reverend Whitlock had stood over it in silence for nearly an hour, his hand hovering inches from the flame, never blinking. After that, he began referring to it as the guardian. He claimed it kept the angel near, that its glow softened the child's cries as they were delivered below. No one dared touch it, not even Elias, who cleaned the floor around it in slow, careful circles, never letting his breath touch the wick. It stayed lit through winter, storms, through baptisms and funerals, through the death of Constance Halloway and the silence of Dr. Wren's vanishing. Mothers came to sit beside it when their babies wouldn't sleep, whispering prayers they couldn't say aloud at home. They believed the candle was proof that something holy still watched over the chapel. But what they didn't know was that Whitlock never allowed it to be trimmed. The wick was never cut. The wax was never replaced. The flame was not fed by oil or fuel. It burned on something else entirely. The night the storm came was like no other. Lightning split the sky above Rose Hollow into veins of fire, and the wind rolled through the chapel rafters like the voice of something waking too soon. The candle flickered for the first time since anyone could remember. Then it sputtered. Then with a soft hiss and a final twist of smoke, it went out. And the roof collapsed, not slowly, not piece by piece. It came down all at once, as if something had waited beneath the shingles for years and was finally free to rise. The rafters snapped in perfect sequence, the beams folding like joints, and the central cross shattered into the pews, splitting a mother's bench in two. The chapel filled with dust and cries, but the stone beneath the altar cracked with a sound far deeper, a splitting noise that seemed to echo from the earth itself. When the townspeople clawed through the debris, they didn't find fire. They didn't find Elias in the choir loft or Whitlock near the pulpit. They found a hole, a vast root system torn open and pulsing with sap so dark it looked black. The roots curled through the chapel's foundation like veins, thick fibrous tendrils wrapped around tiny bones. Infant bones, too many to count. The roots held them like trophies cradled in loops of bark fused with bits of cloth and string. Between them were scraps of parchment, sermon pages, leather-bound and pierced with nails. The writing was Whitlock's, but the pages were stiff with dried blood. Verses about pruning, about the death of sound, about what must be cut away before something clean can grow. Beneath the rubble, in the space where the candle had once stood, they found Elias. He was curled into himself like a root knot, his skin pale, his robe torn. His mouth moved, humming softly. The same backward communion hymn heard through the organ weeks before. His eyes were open but not blinking. They had been sewn wide with rosary wire, the beads digging into the corners, sealing the lashes apart so that nothing could be unseen. His fingers were wrapped around a piece of brass, the broken tip of the baptism fork, its prongs still blood-stained. He did not speak. He did not scream. He just hummed. Over and over again, they tried to move him, but the ground shook when they touched him. Not violently, rhythmically like breath, as if the chapel itself had lungs buried in the roots. The decision was made to seal the site. A crew from the next town was brought in, paid in cash, told only that the structure was unstable and the basement held gas. The hole was filled with stone and ash. The bones were not buried. They were burned quickly and quietly. But the smell never left. Reverend Whitlock was never found. No body, no blood, just a single page nailed to the inside of the pulpit's door, untouched by fire or collapse. It read, "The flame was never meant to burn wax. It was meant to hold time. There were no initials, no signature, only a thumbprint at the bottom, pressed in brine, ringed by rosemary ash." In the weeks that followed, Elias was taken to the nearest asylum. But the humming never stopped. It grew louder in the night. The nurses said he never slept. that he only stared and whispered rhythms that made the other children in the ward soil their sheets and beg to go home. Eventually, the asylum moved him to a cellar room lined with mirrors and thick cloth, calling it precaution. But it was an echo of Wren's chamber, a continuation, a new route, and above the sealed hole where the candle once burned, the soil cracked in summer, split by a sprig of rosemary that grew without sun or water. The candle had gone out, but what it had fed was still alive, and deep beneath Rose Hollow, something waited for the wick to be lit again. When the reports first reached Frankfurt in the spring of 1882, they were faint echoes. Fragments of concern passed through regional constables and wary circuit judges. No bodies were sent, no arrests made. Just the memory of infant deaths that never made it to paper, parents who stopped speaking, and a chapel that had collapsed under its own breath. But someone somewhere had kept the records. A ledger surfaced, unsigned but stamped with the diocese's seal, documenting unapproved baptisms performed without witness or medical oversight. An anonymous physician's letter, copied and mailed from Louisville, described ritualized puncture trauma to the cranial roof of newborns, believed to induce permanent silence in place of breath. There were photographs, too, grainy, smudged but real. A charred candle holder, rosemary braided into bone, and in the margins of a burned sermon page, a child's name crossed out with black wax. The Kentucky General Assembly acted with unusual speed. Within months, they passed the Infant Rites Reform Act, banning all solitary baptisms, mandating that at least 2 unrelated adults and 1 licensed medical examiner be present at any religious rite involving a child under 6 months. Priests and ministers were required to log each infant's weight, breathing pattern, and verbal response within 24 hours of baptism. Any failure to do so would result in the church losing its license to perform rites for 1 year. The law made headlines for a week, then it was buried under other news: floods, elections, rail expansions. Rose Chapel was not mentioned by name. It didn't have to be. Everyone who needed to know knew. The land was sealed by court order, but no claim was ever filed against the diocese. No compensation was ever granted to the families. The stone gate leading to the chapel was left standing, its iron cross blackened by storm fire and hung with a warning sign that rusted to illegibility within a decade. Children were told not to play there, though no one ever saw them try. The soil remained cold even in summer. Rosemary continued to grow without planting. No buyer ever came forward for the property. In 1921, the Kentucky State Board of Medical Ethics quietly established a subcommittee on ritual-based infant mortality. Its findings were never published publicly, but minutes from the meetings were archived and sealed for 50 years. When finally reviewed in 1971, they revealed an alarming pattern across multiple counties. Premature deaths of newborns following solitary religious ceremonies, each with similar signs. Dried blood at the soft palate, bruising behind the ears, and an absence of natural lung inflation. In one case, a baby had been found with a fragment of brass in the back of the throat, removed only during a final autopsy ordered by a new coroner unfamiliar with local tradition. That coroner disappeared the following year. His name was scratched out from all town records, and his house was condemned after a fire destroyed everything but the basement, where jars of preserved tongues were found buried in plaster walls. In 1956, the state authorized construction of a psychiatric hospital on the old Rose Chapel grounds. There was no ceremony, no blessing, no mention of what lay beneath. The hospital was meant to house post-war trauma cases, veterans and orphans, children labeled unfit for mainstream schools. But the problems began within the first year. Patients reported vivid nightmares. One child drew the same image every day for 6 months. A cradle filled with salt and metal, with a mouthless baby curled inside. Nurses complained of organ music playing faintly through the ventilation system, though no sound equipment was installed. Water would drip from light fixtures during full moons, always tinged pink. Staff turnover was rapid. 3 attendants were institutionalized themselves. A visiting bishop requested a tour in 1962 and collapsed upon entering the East Wing, muttering something about voices trapped in glass. That wing was closed permanently. The Rose Chapel Memorial for the Unnamed was erected in 1989, a small stone slab with no names, just the outline of a cradle and a single phrase carved along the bottom. Their silence was not theirs to choose. The memorial was defunded within months after public backlash. Some called it heretical. Others called it a stain on the town's legacy. Vandals knocked it over the following year. No one replaced it. Today, the only thing that marks the chapel's location is a patch of earth that grows nothing but rosemary, its roots dry as ash and bitter to the taste. Those who study the case now, if they dare to call it that, argue whether it was madness, faith, or something older that drove the deaths. They debate Whitlock's motivations, whether he believed he was saving the souls or offering them to something darker. But the methods speak for themselves. Each act was ritualized, perfected, refined. Each death served the next, and the system once built sustained itself. Helpers emerged. Silence became sacred, and the suffering was carried forward in calm, patient hands. The question that remains is not how it happened, but how it went so long unseen. How it wore the robe of holiness, how it whispered in scripture, how it soaked its cloth in salt and called it cleansing. Because evil does not always wear a scowl or wield a knife. Sometimes it blesses you first. Sometimes it wets your forehead and calls you chosen. Sometimes it hums a hymn while holding your child beneath the water and tells you that the scream you hear is nothing more than the devil leaving. And sometimes we let it. So what do you think? Could this happen again? Or has it already in ways we still choose not to name?